Section 3. Things we do every so often. Chapter 19. Garden. The day we crossed over the Wisconsin-Iowa border, I suddenly became silent. Lisa had joined me for the drive from my temporary home in New Hampshire to my new residence near Burr Oak, Iowa. As she drove, I looked out at the rolling hills, the numerous silos of dairy farms, and the cows. So many cows. "That's a Guernsey. Those black and white ones are called Holsteins," she commented. Years later, she told me that my silence revealed internal anxiety. She was right. We had been dating for only a few months, but she had an intuitive sense that my apprehension level was growing. What have I got myself into, I thought. 6 months earlier, the prospect of going to a new part of the country for a 1-year internship seemed appealing. A year in farm country, how wonderful that would be. As we got closer and closer, however, the reality of moving to a place and culture I had no reference point for was daunting. I was about to discover a whole new aspect of the American experience. By winter, we were married, and in the spring we decided to plant a garden in the yard of our all-white rustic farmhouse. Our neighbor got us started with the first plow of the area. New friends made suggestions, and a mischievous church member thought it would be fun if we had a rooster and a hen. A year of farm life connected me to the heartland, a place of relative innocence on the surface, summer community softball, and the realization that farmers are the hardest working people on the planet. Having a garden the size of a McDonald's parking lot was no easy task either. Of all the activities we engage in during a year, gardening is so obviously a spiritual practice that it seems self-evident. Why even include a chapter? Well, this book is about making the obvious more obvious. I am no gardener. My wife fulfills that role. I am the leaf raker and occasional wheelbarrow operator. For her, there is pleasure in working the soil, planting seeds, and basking in the beauty of late spring, summer, and autumn in New England. Over the years, I've watched Lisa delight in tending the flower garden or weeding an organic vegetable garden. That garden yields vegetables for a community food pantry, thus providing visitors with fresh herbs. Throughout the season, a display of freshly harvested tomatoes, kale, or sweet peas are draped over a table next to the canned goods and kitchen supplies. Those who work the garden tend to it according to a semi-organized schedule and their availability. Each spring, an annual cleanup is arranged, followed by regular watering and weeding, along with attention to pest control. The pests can range from insects to deer to curious onlookers, all looking for a sample. Why would anyone spend all this time and energy? Would it not be more efficient to raise some extra money and merely purchase vegetables and fruits from the local supermarket? Possibly, but efficiency is not the point. The point is community building among like-minded lovers of soil and seeds, as well as the intangible virtue of love extended through the ground to those in need. Gardening is a spiritual discipline. In fact, one may not find the garden club listed on the church website under the category of a spiritual growth group. But isn't that what it is? If gardening isn't everyday spirituality, then I'm not sure we're able to go any further. The oldest profession in the world dates back about 10,000 years to the part of the world now known as the Middle East, Syria, Israel, Iraq, and Egypt. There in the valleys of the Fertile Crescent and along the Nile River, our ancestors began planting and harvesting crops of wheat, lentils, barley, peas, flax, and chickpeas. Over the millennia, potatoes, tomatoes, apples, and oranges were gradually added as trade among ancient peoples diversified the human palate. In the ancient world, everyone was a gardener. Or, at least every family had a garden and people who tended the garden. It's no wonder that the great Genesis poem on the origins of human life depicts a garden as the birth room for the first people. Adam and Eve emerge from the earth and one another in a place of rich, lavish vegetation. Even the names of these two are indicative of their origins. Adam in Hebrew is Adamaha, which means of the ground, and Eve is our translation of Isha, meaning from the man. Man is Ish, pronounced Ish. Eve would be Isha. I'd hate for you to go around calling all men Ish, as in ick. But that's another story. Or is it part of the story? Anyway, indeed, these earth creatures are of the ground. They start life in the garden, and things go pretty well until some selfishness takes over. The point here is that the paradise called Eden is the place people call home, both in the spiritual and metaphorical senses, and also in the practical, can we eat sense? When you are gardening, you are getting yourself back to the garden, back home. The garden and spiritual life weave together throughout history. When the Moors conquered Spain in the 8th century, they introduced the construction of minarets and mosques, and the practice of gardening. Their contribution and cultivation of gardens impacted much of southern Europe, introducing dates, figs, almonds, apricots, apples, pears, plums, and peaches. They also grew a wide variety of flowers, including roses, hollyhocks, narcissus, violets, wallflowers, and lilies. It may have been the Dark Ages for much of Europe, but there was a bright spot of diversifying agriculture. Christian monasteries were also centers of gardening as plants with medicinal qualities were added to the typical European glimpse of Eden. As trade expanded, new herbs, lawns, and vegetables were introduced into gardens as havens for spiritual and intellectual growth. The monasteries of the Middle Ages were not only the centers that sustained the writings of the Christian origins, Greek philosophy, and Roman history, but also sanctuaries of healthy living. These gardens were sources of food for the table and places of beauty and meditation. Another aspect of gardening as a form of everyday spirituality is the wonder, joy, pleasure, delight, and the health benefits of being in the natural world. We discussed this in an earlier chapter on walking in the wild. Numerous scientific studies have shown that natural environments can have remarkable benefits for human health by promoting positive emotions and heightened physical and mental energy. Nature has been linked to positive impacts on children diagnosed with impulsivity, hyperactivity, and attention deficit disorder. We live in a world increasingly dominated by information overload, a cauldron of online opinions, and the distraction of the latest shiny object. Perhaps a walk in a garden is a prescription for health. No author has captured the beauty, wonder, and spirituality of nature better than Cape Cod poet Mary Oliver. Throughout her writings, she uses images of life to lift the reader into the realization that the holy and sacred await us in the natural world. Her poem, Today. Today I'm flying low, and I'm not saying a word. I'm letting all the voodoos of ambition sleep. The world goes on as it must. The bees in the garden rumbling a little, the fish leaping, the gnats getting eaten, and so forth. But I'm taking the day off, quiet as a feather. I hardly move, though really I'm traveling a terrific distance. Stillness, one of the doors into the temple. From her book, 1,000 Mornings. The two most prevalent themes in the submissions I received for this book were personal accounts of grief and stories about time spent in nature. Person after person wrote stories of a time in a forest, on a desert sand dune, or meandering through a garden. These times in the wild seemed to lend themselves to encounters with the holy. Mary wrote of an early summer morning in her flower garden. The garden seeds had been planted weeks earlier, so her visit was intended simply to take care of the weeds. It was one of the first warm mornings of the season, and the sun had just started over the horizon. Our intrepid gardener was on her knees, replanting a section dug up the night before by some pesky visitor seeking a snack. In the stillness, she noticed the aroma of the fertile soil underneath her. Then, as the sunlight stretched through openings in the trees and warmed her back, she felt compelled to lie down on her stomach in the garden. She lay quietly for what seemed like hours, her head turned to the side and her ear resting on the earth. And she heard a sound, a sort of humming. After a long while of intently listening, she realized what it was. The sounds of seeds germinating, their early roots beginning to extend into the ground, the movement of the soil as plants started to grow. She wrote, "It was as if I heard the sound of life, the gift of life, of God's creation, actually happening before my very ears." My friend Dave describes a similar event from his childhood. His grandfather woke him well before dawn so that they could get to the cornfields on their farm in South Dakota. Dave obeyed his elder when told to lie down in the cornfield and listen. After a short while, in the silence of the moments before sunrise, he heard it, the sound of the corn popping in the husks. The earth was alive. All creation was singing. When you are in the garden, you are praying, even if you are not thinking of a prayer. When you are in the garden, you are praying while you are hoeing the soil, watering the ground, planting the seeds, and yes, even at the end of the season as you are putting the garden to bed for the winter. In your gardening, you are practicing an everyday spirituality that is connected with tens of thousands of years of human history, and with the source of all this miracle growth activity you are touching. To garden might be the most spiritual of all our everyday practices. Let us come alive to the splendor that is all around us and see the beauty in ordinary things. Thomas Merton.